hello to everyone joining us today. I would like to introduce Robb Herndon, who does sales and marketing for Sovereignty First. Robb, can you please give us a brief orientation about what Sovereignty First does?
So we really focus on helping people and organizations develop solutions to big complex problems. And we believe that those solutions can only come through cooperative negotiation and collaborative action. And that crosses sectors, borders, cultures, and factions. And that those effective negotiations and collaboration only occurs when 4 conditions are in place. And those conditions are inclusion, trust, common understanding, and engagement. So we provide protocols for our clients to build each of those 4 conditions. And we do that through online training, workshops, or we build the conditions for people on the ground.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Robb, could you be a little bit more specific by what you mean by big, complex problems?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah, we get that question all the time, actually. So we define complex problems as a range from things like managing a watershed to dealing with forced mass migrations. It could be issues like global warming or deforestation, water problems in a place like California. So the big threats to the world, but we look at it as how can we address localized problems that then kind of feed into the larger, more global problems.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
So what do you believe is the hardest part about trying to solve these big, complex problems?
Well, you know, there are, I would say, many respected problem solvers with successful careers in, building out solutions, people that have spent their entire lives working on these problems. And there are plenty of wealthy donors, powerful interest groups, people who are very, they're set on finding these solutions to the problem. So what we set out to do is to find out why those solutions aren't working. And so what we really wanted to focus on is trying to answer that question of why those solutions aren't taking hold. Why aren't we seeing the positive change that we want to see towards these solutions? So I would say really looking at all of those, when we deal with complex problems, there's a lot of intertwined problems that are as complex as, say, if you want to solve deforestation, what are the economic problems? What are the political problems? What are the social problems that exist in a specific location that prevents those solutions from taking hold? So what we've discovered is that there's just too many variables for any one group or one single person to really take into account when trying to solve these problems. So how can we take all of those potential variables and problems into account when we're trying to solve the specific problem that we're focused on?
Okay, all right. Well, could you give an example of some situations or scenarios like this?
Sure. Yeah, I try to think of things like if you say want to solve the problems with orangutans in a place, an island like Borneo, where the orangutans are native to those forests, but the forests are being chopped down, so the orangutans are losing their natural habitat. And so how can we, if you're someone who wants to try to solve that problem, what are all of the different variables that you have to take into account? You may think, well, I should align myself with environmental groups who want to save the forest. Maybe I'll align myself with groups that represent the local populations that live in the forest, that depend upon the forest for, their survival. And we think about, okay, those are easy allies that I can find. But what are all of the other factors that go into potentially saving the orangutans? And that could include businesses or the economy on the island of Borneo that relies upon logging. So there are a lot of jobs that are created by logging companies that go in, log certain parts of the forest. There's palm oil plantations that are built on the land that the logs are cleared from. There's supply chains all the way across the world. Governments and countries in Western Europe buy timber from these companies in Borneo. And so you have all of these different factors that then go into something that's seemingly as simple as trying to save the orangutans.
Right.
And so those are all of the different intertwined problems that someone would have to deal with. So that's kind of where we look at it. How can we address all of those problems simultaneously?
Okay, that sounds like a lot of people that need to be included to
Yes.
save the orangutans. So what prevents people from forming large coalitions that include all of those interests?
Right. Well, to be honest, what we've found, what our research shows, is that most of these organizations or the groups, if you're trying to solve the problem with orangutans, you might not even be aware of all of these other groups that are involved with the problem. And quite honestly, you may not want to include all of those interests. You may not want to speak to the logging companies. You may not want to speak to people who own the palm oil plantations. So we tend to find that those are the two main reasons why groups tend not to be included in discussions, negotiations, agreements.
So then why should those groups be included? If they're not helping the situation, or if they're not in alignment with your goal, then why include them?
Right, absolutely. That's a great question. The answer is honestly, it's pretty cold-blooded, and really it comes down to the fact that these groups have the power to help or hinder any negotiation, any agreement. So any agreement that happens that those people aren't included in or are actively excluded from, they have the power to shut down those agreements, whether that's political power, economic power, power within society. So if they're not included and they're not talked to, they can sabotage and break down any of those agreements.
So then how can people and organizations identify the groups that need to be included and make sure that those groups are in fact included?
Sure, absolutely. And the answer to that is actually pretty simple. It's to ask them. So not even the best experts, I would say. There's people who are engaged in the business of finding out that information of who are all of these people who should be included, what is their power, how are they related to the problem. And I would say even those experts can't identify every single group that may have the power to help or hinder an agreement. So really it's just to ask them. So identify, doing an initial research, talking to experts, finding out maybe a general idea of who all those groups are, and then just reaching out and asking them, like, who are the other groups that should be involved? What groups do you know of that are either involved in trying to solve the problem, or if you're asking a logging company, maybe it's what are other parts of your supply chain? Who are people that are influential that may need to be included in discussions? Who would be affected by any change in the dynamics of this problem?
That makes a lot of sense. So then is that the process that you train people to do in the first online training class?
Yes, it is. We go much more into depth about all of the different protocols involved. How do we find those answers? We train you in the processes. We apply them specifically to social entrepreneurs, social impact investors, businesses that could be involved, government agencies that could be involved. So all of those groups that we talked about earlier in that example with the orangutans, well, there are all of those different sectors involved in that problem. So how do we approach each of those people in those sectors or organizations in those sectors? How do we apply the protocols to each of them? So that's mostly what we go through in the first class.
All right. So it's important to include all of those sectors in negotiations and agreements.
It is essential, and people may opt in and out of any of those agreements, but the fact that you reached out to and gave them the opportunity to be included is really key, because they can't come back later and say, well, I was excluded from the negotiations. They may not like the agreement, but given the opportunity to participate in discussions, negotiations, agreements, tends to be enough to help those agreements that people reach to be more effective over the long term and be more sustainable.
Okay. So then what happens if all of the groups that you identified don't trust each other?
Yeah, that's a great question, because lack of trust is certainly a problem when we're talking across sectors. Why would environmental groups trust logging groups? Or why, in the reverse, why would logging groups trust environmental groups? There's a natural, the interests of both groups don't align. So there's going to be a lack of trust. And so what we found is people make trade-offs in who to include in negotiations, how much do we trust them? Because as we talked about, if you don't include all of the people who are necessary, they could sabotage or break down an agreement after you come to it. Right. But if you include everyone, now it's a little chaotic. You have too many people trying to negotiate. How do you manage all of those people? So somewhere along that scale, that spectrum, people make trade-offs on who to include, but ultimately those trade-offs tend to fail anyway, because then you're still not including everyone in the negotiations. And it is true that there's a perception that if you include all those people, the lack of trust can break things down.
So inclusion and trust seem like pretty obvious conditions for collaborative negotiations then.
Yeah.
Is there any way to break that inclusion trust dilemma?
Yeah, there is actually. So inclusion and trust are pretty obvious, and I think they're goals that people believe in. That we should build inclusion and we should build trust, but it does lead to that dilemma. And what we've discovered is that you have to include two other conditions, which also seem kind of obvious, but being able to reach those two conditions can be challenging. So first, we believe that all the groups that need to be included in the negotiations, they need to come to a common understanding of what the problem is, what are the competing interests and threats that are connected to that problem, what is the capacity in the location. So if we're talking on the island of Borneo, what is the capacity of the groups there, the government? What is the situation? How easy is it to enforce agreements in that location? And then we really try to get people into what are potential solutions and coming to a common understanding of what each party's solution could look like. And all of that, all of those interviews, we believe should be done by an outside third party, or it could be a group that's involved. But all of those questions should be asked of each person, each group that should be included. We call those people prime actors. And then all of the information that is collected should be shared. It should be collected anonymously, and then shared with everyone who's included in the discussions, in the negotiations, and in the agreement. So creating that common understanding of all of those factors really helps groups to build trust. And we don't mean trust in the sense that you're going to agree with them or trust that you're even going to like them, but just trust that you can predict their behaviors. You know what their interests are, and you know why it's important to continue to include them. So having that common understanding. And then the second, we call it the fourth condition, is engagement. So really ensuring that everyone, all of the prime actors, have access to all of the discussions, all of the negotiations. So, if it's in a local place, but you hold the negotiations in Geneva, Switzerland, how accessible are those discussions and negotiations to people who can't travel, whether they don't have the economic means to travel or they lack the ability. So if you don't provide access to everyone, then people are not going to remain engaged in those discussions. So you really don't have inclusion if you don't allow for ease of access into negotiations. So those are really the four conditions that we focus on: inclusion, trust, common understanding, and engagement.
So with common understanding and engagement, is it possible to have full inclusion and adequate trust?
Absolutely. Yeah, and again, we get back to, there's never going to be a perfect situation. This isn't a magical panacea. Everyone's not going to get along all of a sudden, and but it really allows for, when you have those four conditions, when you add common understanding and engagement, it really allows for a level of collaboration, allows for a level of cooperation that wouldn't exist otherwise. So people, when they're offered, when people are actively trying to cooperate and collaborate with them, the natural instinct is to find some way to cooperate or collaborate. So it begins to break down those barriers. And again, it's not magical. It doesn't happen overnight. But through rounds and rounds of interviews and discussions and talks, when everyone is included, when everyone has ease of access, when everyone has a common understanding of the problem, and then when people can trust each other enough, when there's an adequate level so that we know we can predict each other's behavior, deals actually just emerge on their own. It's pretty spectacular. Yeah, people want to engage with each other. They'll find ways to collaborate. What can you give so that I can give something? Maybe we create different zones. There's a lot of different ways that people will find solutions, as long as there's the right conditions to create that cooperation and collaboration.
So, and are there protocols to follow for each of these?
There are. So that's what we have spent through different businesses that our founder, Eric Wolterstorff, has started, working with different governments, working in different sectors. He has developed, and we have built the protocols out for each of those four conditions. So similar to the protocols for inclusion, there are specific protocols to follow to build trust and common understanding and ensure engagement.
Awesome. So what is possible when all of these conditions are present, each of the four conditions that you've been describing?
Yeah, it's funny to think about finding solutions to those problems that seem intractable at the moment. How do we think about forced mass migrations right now, whether that's to violence and war or the loss of local resources? People have to move because the farmland that they've spent generations on has eroded. There's environmental degradation, so people have to move. It's really, for me, it's seeing that there is a way to address those problems in a very concrete, step-by-step process, so that people can come to agreements about what those things look like. What do solutions for those things actually look like? And is it possible to enforce those agreements without any outside enforcement mechanisms? We don't have to get the UN involved to come in and enforce an agreement that the Western world thinks is the right solution for this local place. We can engage all of the actors, all of the prime actors on the ground in that location, and include Western society if it needs to. We can include the UN if that's necessary, include multinational corporations. So everyone then is involved in finding those solutions, and then everyone has a stake in keeping those agreements and engagements going. And if something changes, if there's a drastic change in the location, then that network has already been built. Those relationships have been built, so people can make changes to the agreements as necessary. So again, it's not something that will happen overnight, but it's really building that foundation for those groups to really work together and cooperate over decades, over generations, and really come up with solutions that work for everybody.
Right. And because those relationships are built and that trust is established, then, as you said, if later down the road issues come up, they know who the prime actors are. They know who to engage with, and they also know that they've done it before and they've been able to come and arrive at solutions. So I think that's really powerful and quite revolutionary, actually. So I just want to say thank you so much, Rob. So now we would like to open this discussion to questions from the audience.
Great. Well, thank you, Stephanie. That was, I really enjoyed talking through this with you. So I'm looking forward to taking any questions.
Awesome. All right. While we wait for these questions to flow in, I was wondering if you could give sort of 4 concrete examples of each of the 4 conditions that you have been describing.
Sure. That's a great question. So,
not like this.
No, that's okay. This is good. So, I would take an example of let's think of something that's very contemporary right now, something with COVID, and we've talked with someone who they wanted to set out to help kids in their local community to stay active during the coronavirus when everyone's locked inside. And so we talked with this person and asked them about all of what they went through to make this happen. And they set out, they had an idea to bring kids to a local park, and they wanted to make sure that everyone stayed at a safe distance. They wanted to do social distancing. So they came up with an idea to play games. So, tags out, obviously.
Yeah.
Kids can do obstacle courses. They can there's different activities that they can do. And so this person thought, well, that's a great solution. They talked with people, they got all these kids to the park, and they did it once, and then all of the neighbors complained because they saw kids playing at the park. And so they, people were scared, and they thought, what is this person doing? So they called their local government, and the government actually shut it down. And so this person who came up with this idea was really disheartened. And so what she decided to do was reach out to those neighbors who had complained, reach out to the local government who had shut her down, and to find out their concerns. So what was their understanding of the problem? What was their understanding of the solution? What did it look like for them? And so she took all of those very informal interviews that she did, solutions that people had come up with. She wrote out a new proposal, ran it by the local city council, and then it was approved. And so she was able to take in all of the concerns that people had and to create something that worked for everybody. So I would say, that's an example of including the people that need to be included, coming to a common understanding of what those problems are, engaging people in the process, and through that really building trust with all of those people that, I'm not out here trying to do something that's going to jeopardize anyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just so everyone's then behavior is predictable. The neighbors know what she's doing. She knows what their concerns are. She found that actually more people joined in than she had initially. So it became a really successful program. And it was because she was really able to work on those 4 conditions.
That's awesome. That's a great example. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
All right, we've got our first question. So how do we overcome the challenges of finding the right or appropriate communal leaders and voices?
Ryan, that's a great question. I think it's again that process of really reaching out to people in the community. A lot of people, I think through our research, we kind of find the big, the most well-known, the more famous, whether it's entrepreneurs in a space or community leaders in a space. And if you reach out and actually ask those people, who do they think should be included? So just a simple, really straightforward question of who can they identify in the space that they think should be included, has a voice, or is someone that they connect with. And then there's a process of ranking each of those people based on their relative influence, and that's something we actually get into in the class. So that's one of the protocols that we get into, and creating a ranked list of the prime actors, and then that's the basis for who should be included going forward.
It sounds complex and yet simple at the same time. So you're covering this in the course that you're going to be offering, or that you are offering, I guess.
Yeah, we are offering. Yeah, it's live now.
That's awesome.
But yes, that is what we get into. Yeah, those kinds of protocols. How do we identify those people? Because it is really challenging. It's not simple. That is some of the main obstacles that we come across when trying to solve complex problems. Is who should be included? What voices should be included? How do we identify them accurately? How do we know that we're including the right people? Not just thinking that we've included the right people.
Right. All right. So you described earlier, you were discussing the watershed issue in California.
Yeah.
So how would you address that issue? I know that that's like we've said, a big complex problem. could you give some examples of what you
Sure.
might have?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad that you asked that because I'm from California originally, so
Oh,
yeah, I have a little bit of an idea
okay.
of what goes into that. But I would say I don't even know all the
Mhm.
people who should be included.
Mhm.
So, it would range in a state as big as California, um, who, who are the environmental groups in Northern California who are trying to protect um, the sources of water,
Mhm.
who are the big businesses in a place like Los Angeles, Hollywood. There are big industries in Los Angeles that use a lot of water. There's a lot of people in Los Angeles that use a lot of water. Then you have all of the agricultural businesses in Central California who use a lot of the water.
Mhm.
Have small towns that don't have or have poor access to water. So how do we include those people? Those problems tend to cross a lot of cultural boundaries also. A lot of the small towns in Central California are made up of farm workers. They tend to be Mexican in descent, or at least Latino in descent. So getting access to those communities who speak Spanish predominantly, how do we cross those boundaries? So how is it possible to include all of those people? And you may say, well, isn't that a problem for the state government?
Mhm.
And the answer really is that it should be, but those problems, getting all of those people to come together and make agreements, is even more complex than a strong state government like California can handle. So there's ways that we think of these problems as being too big, and yet the solutions really can be localized. We can engage all of those people in discussions and then build those networks amongst all of those groups of people so that they can find solutions that work for them.
Mhm. All right. Nope. All right. So, what if we know someone or group needs to be included in the discussion, but they refuse to engage or participate? How do we overcome this difficulty?
That's a really great question, Mateen. Thank you for that. And it is a challenge. Yeah, you may identify some really fabulous groups that have a lot of power and a lot of influence, and for whatever reason, they may choose not to engage or not to participate. And we've actually found the research shows that once you get all of the groups that want to be involved, even at the very beginning, once you start to build those relationships and those groups start to come to agreements with each other, and those agreements are effective, we actually find that those groups who didn't want to include themselves at the beginning now realize that, oh, there's these groups and they're doing really great things, and they're coming to agreements and they're finding solutions. They tend to then um, self-involve in
Okay.
those negotiations, because now there's a reason for them to do so.
Mhm.
They see the momentum that's being built by other groups. So they usually self-select then into those negotiations. So I would say it's a process that happens over time. And if you get it right with the initial groups who want to be involved, it tends to then bring in those other groups who didn't want to involve themselves in the beginning.
Mhm. That's awesome. So could I ask you a little bit about your background on conflict resolution? And so, how could we apply the four conditions to build peace in a zone of conflict? Could you give an example of how this might apply in Syria?
Sure. Actually, this is really great. We did work. Sovereignty First did work in Syria in 2015, kind of right at the start of the breakdown in the society there, and all of the violence that followed that. It's really, I mean, that's one of the greatest challenges when we see a society fall apart in that way. Groups tend to fall into different categories when a society fractures. And so there are ways of identifying whether those groups are core to the society, if they're a helper, if they're a saboteur. Obviously in Syria, there's a lot of groups that act as saboteurs who break down essentially any deal that could be reached. And so it's being able to identify those groups. And again, you know, it's not groups that we have to like. Especially in a situation where there's been a lot of violence, you're not going to want to actively engage with some of these people. And they may have carried out, they may have done despicable things throughout whatever the conflict is. But, you know, it's really understanding that if you don't include those groups, at least make it possible for them to be included. No agreement's ever really going to work. And we see that actually in Afghanistan. Back in 2002, 2003, after the US had invaded, there was an effort to really bring a lot of groups in Afghanistan together to come to a peace agreement, to come to at least some sort of terms on how to end the violence, but the Taliban was excluded. And, you know, it's hard to really like the Taliban. There's a lot of things that the Taliban does that are despicable. But as we've seen over the past 15, 16 years, the Taliban, because they weren't included in the negotiations, have used violence as a way of sabotaging any of the agreements that were reached by the groups within Afghanistan and then groups in NATO and the United States. So when you don't include groups like the Taliban, it becomes almost impossible for those agreements to be effective over the long term.
Wow, that is a very concrete example that really helps elucidate the necessity to include everyone's voice, whether or not you agree with them, whether or not you can even really engage in a discussion fully with them. It's giving them that opportunity to use their voice and have their needs and their concerns heard, because as you explained, the example with the Taliban, if someone's not included, they will do everything they can to sabotage any sort of solution, right? So
yeah, and it's really difficult. You know, I also think, going back to the Syria example, ISIS, group like ISIS, obviously, you know, their actions are not justifiable, and what things that they carry out should not be a part of a society. It's, you know, it's hard to think about wanting to include a group like ISIS in discussions or negotiations, but the true reality of the problem is that they can sabotage any agreement. And so that alone is the reason why they should be included. Because, you know, we think sometimes of inclusion and trust and common understanding as these aspirational ideas that sound really nice, but then how do we make those concepts work on the ground somewhere? And so we can't just include the people that we like, or we can't just include the people that have ideas that resonate with us, and or come up with solutions that we also think could work. We have to listen and at least give all groups access to some of the discussions. And again, they may choose to exclude themselves. You know, we see it today with the Taliban in Afghanistan. They have been included now more in discussions, and the violence continues. So it's difficult. It's not easy. But the more that groups like the Taliban or ISIS are included, and more that the opportunity for them to be included exists, the easier it will be down the road to include those groups further in discussion. So, you know, again, we get back to, it's not going to happen tomorrow. It may not even happen in a year from now or 2 years, but the more that we involve them in those discussions, the more likely it's going to be down the road that they will be involved, that they will feel that at some level they're a part of the agreement. And so then it becomes harder for them to sabotage that agreement because they had a part in creating it.
So thank you for that answer. How, if I could ask, what did you study, and how did you come to work at Sovereignty First? Like,
Great question. I know you asked that earlier. I got a little off.
That's okay.
I was a teacher actually for about 6 years in California. I taught history. I was really passionate about it, and I was really getting into teaching my students about reasons why groups got into war and violence, and ways to prevent it. And I just got to a point where, you know, I wanted to actually get out. Teaching is very valuable, but for me, I really wanted to be more hands-on with finding solutions, and maybe a little impatient. I'm not sure, but I decided to go back to grad school. I studied conflict and dispute resolution. I got my master's degree in that from the University of Oregon. Then moved out to Washington, D.C. I found that a lot of the groups, a lot of the organizations in D.C. actually didn't have the ideas or the solutions that I was looking for personally. And then about 2 years into being in DC, I came across Sovereignty First and Eric and what he was doing, and I found what I was looking for as a means of a solution. So since September of 2018, I've been involving myself more and more with Sovereignty First, and here we are.
Yeah, time flies.
Time does fly.
All right, we have our next question. So how might we encourage a more open and collaborative mindset around negotiation? The tendency for many is to hold things close to themselves for fear of another party sabotaging any honest effort.
That is a great question, because that is what we come across, and this is actually what we mean by common understanding. So the process, the protocols that we use, it's an idea that's been around since the 1950s, and there's a method of asking these questions. How do we get the answers anonymously? Because you're right, people are fearful of sharing all of this information. Because it could be potentially used against them. And that is why information tends to be held close. This is actually a wonderful time in the history of humanity to do this kind of action, because it's actually easier today to get information. There's more information available to any single person today than President Clinton had from his entire intelligence gathering force from intelligence in the government in the 1990s. So it's much easier to gather information today, but we do still run into that problem of fear of sharing information. And so the way to do that is to gather the information anonymously and share the information anonymously. And we have protocols, we build protocols in place to be able to do that. And then once the information is shared anonymously, we get feedback from everyone. So all of the information is shared with all of the prime actors. All of the prime actors give feedback on the information that's shared with them anonymously. And then that information is actually put on a public forum that is also shared anonymously. So no group is ever directly attached to whatever they said in a previous round. And so it also gives people the ability then to change answers, to change perception of a problem or a solution without losing face. So people aren't then attached to what they said the first time you interviewed them, because their name has never been associated with the information that they shared.
Right. That's awesome. And is this also included in the course that you're going to be?
Yes, it will be. Yes, it will be. So, right, the course that we have now is really to do the protocols on how to identify all of the prime actors. So that's inclusion. Mm-hmm. But we will, those future courses are coming. So we didn't want to overwhelm everyone with all of the protocols. So there are step-by-step solutions for inclusion, step-by-step ways of trust, to do trust. Then with common understanding, there's protocols on how to build, how to do those interviews, how to code it anonymously, how to share that information anonymously. So what are all of the different ways that we can do that? And then what are ways that we can engage people?
So why must inclusion be the first protocol that is established before the other three can follow? And so then is there any reason why you had the particular order of the first, second, third, fourth?
That's a great question. We have figured out eventually all four conditions must be present, but it really does go in the linear order of setting up inclusion. So we can identify everyone that needs to be included. So we don't leave anyone out. We don't accidentally exclude someone because we didn't know that they existed. We didn't know that they were someone who should be included. Gives reasons for, again, why those bad actors that we see, why they should be included. So we, identifying those first, identifying with trust, you really identify how much people trust each other currently. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know that information, it's really hard to then build common understanding. And without common understanding, it's really hard to engage people. So that's why we've set up inclusion and then trust, then common understanding, and then engagement at the end.
That makes a lot of sense. Kind of like, reminds me of sort of like the hierarchy of needs. So you need to get the foundation first and then build on top of that.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly it.
All right. So I've seen a lot of talk about the word convener,
right,
in relation to problem solving. So would you be able to give some sort of description of what a convener is, what they would do, and the difference between, I guess, problem solving or convening?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a great question, because actually I graduated in 2015 with my master's. And even 5 years ago in a master's program, we never came across the word or the role, the title of a convener. So it is pretty new. It's a new concept. So within conflict resolution, there are arbitrators, people who are picked. Usually they're legal experts in some field, and it's usually around a business dispute or a labor dispute. And those arbiters are tasked with coming up with a solution that works for everybody. And you have mediators that do a lot of this work, but they focus really on what goes on during a mediation. So what are the processes once we get groups together? How do we mediate across, those boundaries, cultural boundaries, political boundaries? All of the boundaries exist. There are roles of facilitators, so people who can manage large groups of people and keep discussions flowing. And those are all really valuable roles. And what we discovered is all of the work that we're talking about, a lot of it happens in the background. It's really kind of the grunt work of how do we get these groups of people to even come together in the first place. Right. And so that is actually the role of a convener. And so groups, people, organizations that are involved in finding solutions to a problem can work as a convening organization. They can work as a convener to get people together. But there is a growing trend in the field of people who act as their whole role is convening, so that they help build these relationships across sectors and borders, cultures, factions. And so, we've discovered that actually a lot of this work fits in exactly with the role that conveners should play.
So rather than acting as, like a problem solver, you're acting as a convener and you're bringing these people together.
Right. Okay. Right. And you're not set on any particular solution. You're not set on any method to go forward other than really focusing on building inclusion and trust and common understanding and engagement. And conveners who focus on building those 4 conditions will actually help these groups come to solutions, come to agreements.
So who is a convener then? And then I guess I'll ask the first question, but then what would the difference be between a problem solver and a convener?
Yeah, that's great. A problem solver is really someone who is set on a particular solution. So if we go back to the example of the person who wanted to get kids out and be active in her community, we would think of her as a problem solver. She saw a problem, she came up with a solution, the solution seemed to work, and then she ran into the complexity of the problem.
Yeah.
And so that would then be the difference between a problem solver and a convener. Problem solvers, there are a lot of things that can be solved by being a problem solver. There are things like, how do we build rockets that get into outer space? How can we get to Mars? How can we build solar energy? How can we build electric cars? How do we work to build education, public education? How can we? Those are all problems that, with enough expertise and money, those are things that can be worked on and solved. When it gets to a complex system of problems, it's impossible for one problem solver to come up with a solution that works for everybody. So, it's impossible for one person to come up with a solution to Syria. It's too overwhelming. There's too many issues that are involved with trying to come up with a solution. And so at that point, you really need a convener, someone who is potentially outside of the situation to come in. And how do we then engage all of the groups that should be to build networks and the relationships and everything that goes on in the background, so that these groups can come to an agreement. So you may need facilitators, you may need mediators, you may even need arbitrators, but the work of the convener is to get those groups together, to then they can use the skill sets of those other types of problem solvers.
Right. That's awesome. All right.
I think we're out of time here.
Yeah, I was just going to say, any last questions or comments from the audience? This has been really awesome. I just, I wanted to say thank you so much, Rob, for joining us today. As you can see at the bottom of the screen there, we've got our first course, the Solution Accelerator. It's actually on sale right now. We've got a big discount on there. The sale ends tomorrow. The course actually begins on June the 15th. So there's a link in the description below. You can click on that to find out more. Thank you again so much for joining us today, Rob.
Thank you. And yeah, we look forward to anyone who is interested in this. If this landed for anyone, please sign up for the class, and we want to help you through the process.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We look forward to joining you again for another webinar pretty soon, probably next week.
Thank you, everyone.
And we will see you then. Bye for now.
Bye.